bar stool she took off her ring.
I'm curious how you created that world, how you fictionalized it, and how, not necessarily how you make the real unreal or different from reality, totally. But maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm hesitant to say that's what it is.
No, I think that makes total sense though, because I feel like I'm always really interested in fiction and nonfiction that came out of that moment kind of in the early 60s when there was like the birth of new journalism, and Tom Wolfe was writing like all of those pieces about like what it was, and Hunter S. Thompson was writing his stuff about the Kentucky Derby, and Joan Didion was writing her stuff about California. And I mean, the idea that On the Road was a memoir that they then sold as a novel, you know, because they thought it would sell better. I think there's an interesting argument there, and like, is there a difference between people that take life and then somehow fictionalize it and turn it into a novel, and is that maybe closer to memoir than we think? But my own process with this book was really, like, it really was on a line level. My one goal with this book was, I was studying a lot with Diane Williams, who does all of those, like, you know, very language kind of driven short stories. And this actually, the book started as a 1.5 page short about a light rail and some like young teenage prostitutes that were working a light rail that kind of went across America. And I was in a workshop with Ben Marcus at the time, and he was kind of like, this is the strongest thing you've done, and maybe there's something kind of more here. And then he recommended Lydia Millet's My Happy Life, which I fucking love and is amazing. I mean, everything she's written is incredible. I also just love how she marries like her own activism and desire to talk about like environmentalism and things like that are also really important to me within her fiction, you know. So she creates this sense that it's like a fictionalized world that's also of activism. But My Happy Life, yeah, I mean, it's so sad. Like there's that kind of hyperbolic, you know, the woman starts out this story in a room with just a piece of, you know, with a little pencil and like is writing on the wall. But what's weird about it is the tone, where like the more and more bad things that happen to her, like when she escapes and goes on that like Conradian, you know, journey down the river with that guy who inevitably like rapes her and does all these terrible things to her. The novel does that weird thing of like absorbing that trauma through kind of hyperbolic language. Like, I was so happy, and then he raped me and I was even happier, kind of. And I thought that was one of the most transgressive books I'd ever read. So there was part of me that wanted to explore the idea of transgression through language, really. So with this particular book, and I don't think I would do it the same way, or I'm not doing it the same way for the next one, but I was all about just like putting one good sentence down after the next. Like I'd read the Gary Letts essay, The Sentence is a Lonely Place, and he talks a lot about like, you know, he says like sentences are sort of units where like words have to like rub up against each other and get off on each other, and logically we can kind of think about that the way that like maybe Gordon Lish would have talked about like consecution. And I had this really awesome teacher, Victoria Riddell, who I feel like never gets enough like credit. I think she's such an incredible writer. I mean, she studied with Lish, she was a poet, and she comes at stories through a very like poetic lens. She also worked a lot with Diane over the years, and she's also just a fucking amazing teacher. I had her at Columbia, and her seminar was really great. And she was saying, okay, what if you think about language? Because if, you know, everybody talks about like, okay, you know, Gordon Lish's consecution, well, what does that actually visually mean? And so she said like, okay, you start a story and the first word you use is a set, like literally a mathematical set. Like, so if you have the word, like the story usually uses Amy Hempel's The Cemetery Where Al Jolson is Buried, and the first word in that is like, tell me things I won't mind forgetting, she said, make it useless things or skip it. And so if you take the word tell and think of it as like a mathematical set, then the minute you use that word as a writer, you have the obligation to know that like all the other subwords that would fit in that, you know, set, tell, say, decide, yell, you know, all of those things are words that you can use and you have to use in order to keep like the family of the language going in one direction. But she said the cool thing is you not only get the word, but you get the opposite of the word. So tell, like the opposite of that being withhold. So, you know, through using the word tell, you're also almost like obligated to kind of you're immediately, you have the moral obligation within the prose, or the prose like incites a moral obligation to the opposite, which is to forget. And I just thought that was so fascinating, and that was something that was like the driving impulse behind White Nights, was really, okay, how do I put one sentence down after the next where like the families of language are like moving in that way. And it was overwhelming because I had no idea where I was going. I never came into Columbia intending to write a novel. I was writing I really love Lydia Davis. I was writing really, really short pieces. I love like all the French Nouveau Roman writers like Nathalie Surratt and Robbe-Grillet. Like Nathalie Surratt's ideas about like tropisms, like a tropism being a short story. She says like, okay, well, a story is just something that makes the present hugely amplified. And I felt like that's what I wanted to do with this book, was somehow make the small details of the present moment feel hugely amplified, maybe in the way that like the hyperbolicness of the Millet book did. But I had no idea where it was going. And so then it was a process of like writing a first draft, knowing that the language was there, but then going in and thinking like, what's the story? Like, and all these stories had kind of accrued. So there was the story between the mother and the daughter, and the story between the daughter and Fender, and the daughter and Otto Hauser. And at that point I just realized like the whole frame of the story is sort of like, the impetus for change is that the mother leaves because she feels trapped in this small town, and didn't engage with feminism when she was in college because she came from this like working class Republican background. So she leaves, and in her absence like all this stuff transpires with these two young girls that are there, like Jean and Bertie. Then there's the kind of competing storylines of like Jean and Fender, who's her own age, like a boy that she can kind of legitimately like have a crush on or fall in love with, even though like they're both at that kind of point in their life where he's eventually going to like go to a boys' penitentiary and become his brothers and all those things, but like he's still sort of like innocent enough this summer to hang out with her because she's still so virginal, even though she would like to think otherwise, And then there's a story with her and Otto, which is just the total opposite of that. I mean, it's like the foil to the Fender story, I think. So yeah, form was really what got me interested in writing in the first place. Like before I started, I was working at a bookstore before I applied to grad school. I worked at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, which was this awesome independent place. And I started then being able to, like, from the used department, buy all of these kind of crazy French fiction writer works in translation. I think I was mostly always interested in works in translation, honestly, when it came to fiction. I really love Julio Cortázar. And I guess some works not in translation, like Beckett and things like that too. But I felt like when I discovered like Marguerite Duras and Nathalie Surratt and Robbe-Grillet and those people doing these things where you're saying form, like, I mean, what does it mean for Robbe-Grillet to write Jealousy, a novel about like an affair where he literally like visually, as if he was an architect, draws a blueprint of a home like this with like the windows in it. And it's the woman, so it's kind of an awesome, like, weird feminist story in a way, where it's the woman having the affair, and like the husband is friends, they live in a plantation, is friends with the guy the woman's having the affair with, but he like only traces his wife's body through the room, through which doorways and windows you like see her in as the reader, and there's no emotion in it whatsoever. And so there it's like, that's to me so exciting. Like, he took the most pure idea about form, like, what is voyeurism? It means to watch someone through a window or a door and not be able to communicate, but to be able to know them and know what their story is. And he wrote a novel that used form, period. I think that's such a cool experiment. I mean, I love story like David Markson's Wittgenstein's Mistress, that like, uses the idea of the intellectual fragment, or like Pale Fire doing the same thing. Like, okay, Nabokov taking a bunch of, index cards and writing things on them. But that, for this book, would have felt like, I think, accessory to what it was that I wanted to do. So it felt like the form had to come from one sentence kind of generating the next, basically. But now that I've done that, I think I will do the next one entirely differently.